June 6, 1944. The gray waters of the English Channel churned like liquid steel beneath a storm of wind and gunfire. The sky above was a heavy lid of clouds, pressing down on the thousands of men crammed into landing craft that bobbed violently toward the coast of Normandy. Among them, crouched low with a camera clutched to his chest instead of a rifle, was Robert Capa, a Hungarian-born war photographer who believed that if your pictures weren't good enough, you weren't close enough. Today, he was about to test that belief on the bloodiest beach in history. He wasn't supposed to be there, not this close. Most correspondents stayed offshore or followed later when the shooting stopped. But Capa wasn't like most men. He had covered the Spanish Civil War, photographed Chinese resistance against Japan, and followed American troops through North Africa and Italy. He had seen battle before, but not like this. Even hardened soldiers whispered about Omaha Beach. Rumors said it would be a slaughter. He laughed nervously with the troops, masking fear behind charm and cigarettes. Some of the GIs called him crazy. "You're coming with us with that toy?" one Marine said, tapping his Leica camera. Capa only smiled and said, "Yes, but my toy shoots faster." The insult stuck. Soldiers carried rifles. He carried film. In their eyes, he wasn't a fighter, just an observer, someone who would click and run while others bled. Yet that morning, as the landing craft gate dropped and chaos erupted, it was Capa who didn't run. The first wave of men were torn apart before they even touched the sand. The ocean turned red. Machine guns from German bunkers spat death in perfect rhythm, mowing down anything that moved. The sound was like tearing metal. The air was thick with salt and smoke and screams. Amid it all, Capa stepped forward, knee-deep in freezing water, his cameras slapping against his chest, his body shaking. Not from courage, but from raw human terror. He later wrote that his hands trembled so badly, he thought every photo would be ruined. But he kept shooting. Click, duck, click, fall, get up, click again. The water rose, men fell, the world blurred. Through his viewfinder, he saw faces distorted by fear, helmets knocked sideways, rifles slipping from lifeless hands. He wanted to help but couldn't. All he could do was capture it. That was his duty, his strange, brutal form of combat. One soldier crawled past him, screaming for a medic. Another prayed into the surf before being hit again. Capa pressed the shutter one more time, catching that split second before the sea swallowed the man completely. Later, those moments would become history's most haunting frames of war. Grainy, blurred, half-burned, but alive with terror. At the time, though, Capa thought he'd failed. Waves smashed his legs, his camera almost drowned, and his film canisters filled with water. His landing craft had left. He was alone on the beach with dying men and exploding shells. "I had no choice," he later recalled. "I had to keep on shooting until I ran out of film or courage." Each frame was a heartbeat, each click a confession. He crawled behind a steel obstacle, bullets pinging inches away, and steadied his shaking hands enough to shoot the chaos unfolding. Soldiers crouched behind hedgehogs, medics dragging the wounded, flames licking through the surf. For 30 terrifying minutes, he recorded hell. The irony was brutal. The man the soldiers had mocked for carrying a camera instead of a gun was now risking more than most who carried weapons. His weapon was truth, and truth demanded proximity. He captured not glory but panic, the real face of war stripped of heroism. He photographed a soldier clinging to the surf, water up to his chin, as if trying to hide from the sky. He caught the distant silhouettes of destroyers firing into the cliffs. Every image was slightly out of focus, blurred by trembling hands and salt water on the lens. But in that imperfection lay something pure, reality. When he finally crawled back to the departing craft, his body was numb. He had no idea if the film survived. He had no idea if he would survive. As they pulled away from the beach, he looked back at the smoke curling over Omaha and whispered, "I hope it's worth it." His fingers were bleeding. His camera was dented. His soul was scorched. But he had done what few dared to do. He had stood in the mouth of hell and pressed the shutter. Back in England, the film almost didn't make it. When it reached Life magazine's darkroom in London, an overzealous technician tried to rush the development. In the panic to meet deadline, he overheated the film, melting much of it. Only 11 frames survived out of 106. The rest were lost forever. Some said it was fate. Others said it was the hand of history preserving just enough to haunt us. The surviving photographs were blurred, ghostly, imperfect, but that's what made them unforgettable. Life magazine titled them The Magnificent 11. They called it slightly out of focus, a phrase that became both apology and poetry. Capa's images stunned the world. They were unlike any war photographs ever published. There was no distance, no composure, only raw chaos. Viewers could feel the fear, the confusion, the cold. Soldiers who'd once mocked him now whispered his name with awe. Commanders who thought of him as a nuisance now studied his pictures in silence. The irony had come full circle. The man who was too close for comfort had given the world the closest look at war it had ever seen. He didn't see himself as a hero, though. In his own words, he was a coward with a camera. But perhaps that was what made his courage real, the awareness of fear, and the decision to face it anyway. His photographs didn't glorify war. They exposed it. They turned Omaha Beach from a military operation into a human tragedy. They showed that bravery wasn't always loud or armed. Sometimes it was a man trembling behind a lens, capturing history one heartbeat at a time. As Capa rested that night, staring at the English coast through fogged glass, he couldn't shake the images in his mind. The screams, the water, the faces. The mockery he'd heard before the landing replayed in his head. "You're coming with that toy?" Maybe they were right, he thought. Maybe it was a toy. But it was a toy that could tell the truth, and the truth was the only thing strong enough to outlast the war. 3 stop-scroll lines flash across the screen as the story pauses for breath. He carried no weapon, only a lens. 11 photos survived. 11 glimpses of hell. The man who photographed D-Day wasn't supposed to make it out. The waves crash once more, frozen in time. The camera lingers on a blurred frame of a soldier crawling through surf, face half submerged, fear eternal. The narrator's voice drops to a whisper. The world would soon know his name, but first, it would have to face what his camera had seen. The morning after D-Day, Robert Capa sat in the press quarters at Weymouth, his uniform still soaked, his boots crusted with sand and dried blood. He hadn't slept. The sound of machine gun fire echoed in his ears like a ghost that refused to die. When he closed his eyes, he saw men drowning, faces contorted in panic, arms flailing in dark water. Every time he breathed, he smelled salt and cordite. The invasion was over for him, but the war inside his head had just begun. He lit another cigarette with shaking hands and stared at the little black canisters on the table, the film he had risked his life to shoot. That roll, he thought, might be the only witness that made it out alive. A courier arrived to take the film to London. Capa handed it over without ceremony, pretending not to care. But when the jeep drove off, he felt a jolt of panic, like giving away a piece of his soul. That film held everything. Chaos, fear, the moment the world changed. He didn't know yet that fate was about to play another cruel trick on him. At Life magazine's London office, the darkroom was a frenzy of activity. Deadlines loomed. Editors barked orders. The courier's package was rushed to the lab, where a young technician named Dennis Banks began developing the negatives. The temperature gauge climbed too high. The film, still damp with seawater, started to curl. Banks opened the door to cool it down. But in his haste, hot air from the drying cabinet melted the emulsion. By the time they realized what had happened, most of Capa's images were ruined. The gelatin that held the pictures had turned to a bubbling blur. Of 106 frames, only 11 survived. 11 fragments of hell. When the phone call reached Capa, he said nothing. He just sat there, cigarette halfway to his lips, and let the silence fill the room. Months of preparation, a day of terror, all burned by a single mistake. He could have screamed. Instead, he laughed. A short, bitter sound. "They say my pictures were out of focus," he told a friend later. But the world itself was out of focus that day. He had almost failed. And yet, in that failure, something miraculous happened. The surviving photographs, shaky, blurred and imperfect, looked unlike any other war image ever taken. They pulsed with confusion, movement, fear. They looked like what war felt like. Life magazine editors decided to print them anyway. When the issue hit stands, readers were transfixed. They saw what no one had ever seen before. The first 30 minutes of the Normandy landings, seen from the surf, through eyes that trembled but did not look away. The reaction was electric. Soldiers who had been there said it captured the truth better than any clean, composed image could. Families of the fallen saw in those blurred frames the chaos their loved ones had endured. And photojournalists around the world realized that perfection wasn't the goal, honesty was. Out of accident and fear, Capa had stumbled into a new kind of realism. His blurred frames became icons of authenticity, and his phrase, "slightly out of focus," became a badge of honor. But for Capa himself, the cost remained heavy. Behind the public praise was private torment. He couldn't forget the faces of the soldiers who had died beside him, or the feeling of helplessness that came with photographing men he couldn't save. At night, he drank to silence the memories. "I had to photograph the fear," he said once, "because it was my own." The war had changed him. It wasn't glory he'd captured, it was terror. His editors wanted him to go back, to keep following the invasion deeper into France. He agreed, though his nerves were shredded. Each time he stepped off a landing craft or rode in a convoy, his hands trembled. Yet he couldn't stop. There was something obsessive about his need to keep seeing, to keep recording. Maybe he thought that if he captured enough of it, he'd understand what it all meant. As Allied forces pushed inland, Capa followed with his cameras slung across his shoulders. He photographed medics bandaging wounds under apple trees, refugees clutching children, tanks rolling through shattered villages. His images were raw and unfiltered, showing war not as strategy but as survival. And yet, even amid the chaos, he still doubted himself. In his memoir years later, he wrote that he felt like a ghost walking among ghosts. He often thought of that moment on Omaha Beach, the second before he pressed the shutter, when he thought he might die. That memory haunted him more than any explosion. He had captured the most important photographs of his life, but at the cost of part of his soul. When asked why he hadn't joined the soldiers in fighting, he answered simply, "Because my job is to show what they fight for." The turning figure in his life appeared not in the trenches but in the aftermath. John Morris, Life's picture editor. Morris believed in Capa even when others doubted him. He was the one who decided to print the damaged film, recognizing that imperfection could carry emotional truth. Without Morris, those 11 photos might have been discarded as technical failures. Together, they changed how the world saw war. No longer did it look heroic or clean. It looked human, messy, chaotic, tragic. The breakthrough wasn't just artistic, it was moral. Before Capa, war photography often served propaganda. It showed soldiers standing tall, flags waving, victories secured. Capa's D-Day photographs showed the opposite. Confusion, fear, men drowning before even reaching shore. They forced the public to confront what war actually was. His lens became a witness, not a weapon. The revelation came slowly to Capa himself. For weeks after D-Day, he couldn't bring himself to look at the prints. When he finally did, something shifted. The blur, the chaos, it wasn't failure. It was honesty. It was how memory worked under fire. No one remembered war in sharp focus. It was always fragments, panic, flashes of noise and pain. His damaged film had revealed something deeper than clarity ever could. He began to realize that his role wasn't just to show battle, but to preserve humanity within it. When he photographed a soldier lighting a cigarette with trembling hands, or a medic shielding a wounded man from rain, he wasn't documenting strategy, he was documenting endurance. Every frame became a small act of defiance against forgetting. Still, the cost remained. His nerves never recovered. He joked that he could only take pictures with one hand, because the other was too busy shaking. But he also knew he could never stop. "Once you've seen war through a lens," he told a friend, "you can't go back to seeing the world any other way." By late 1944, Capa had become a legend. The man who had once been mocked for bringing a camera instead of a rifle was now the most famous combat photographer alive. Magazines called him fearless, though he laughed at that word. Fear, he said, was his constant companion. Courage was simply doing the job anyway. Yet he couldn't escape the feeling that he had borrowed time. So many soldiers he'd photographed had died within minutes. He often wondered why he had lived when so many hadn't. That survivor's guilt lingered like a shadow. His friends noticed he drank more, joked louder, moved faster, always chasing something unseen. When he finally returned to Paris, liberated and bright with celebration, Capa wandered the streets in silence. He photographed kisses, laughter, champagne, joy reborn after years of horror. But behind the smiles, he still saw ghosts. For him, victory was complicated. The world had been saved, but the cost could never be repaid. He mailed a letter to Morris. The pictures came out fine in the end, maybe too fine. Every time I close my eyes, I see them again. He didn't know it yet, but those blurred 11 frames would outlive him. They would define his legacy, shape war photography for generations, and prove that sometimes the most imperfect images tell the most perfect truth. And yet one question lingered, quiet and cruel. If the camera had survived the beach, had Robert Capa himself? The answer would come later, but not on Omaha's sand. By the summer of 1944, the tide of war had turned. The Allies were driving east through France, and every liberated town brought both joy and ruin. Robert Capa followed them, his 2 kantas hanging from his neck, his boots still bearing the stains of Normandy's sand. He had gone from the crazy photographer with the toy to a living legend among correspondents. Soldiers greeted him by name now, offering cigarettes, calling him the guy who made Omaha real. His 11 blurred frames had changed everything. They had turned chaos into testimony. But behind the new respect lay a deeper truth. Capa's work was no longer about capturing battles. It was about showing the human cost of victory. As the Allied machine advanced, Capa traveled through hedgerows and ruins, sleeping wherever the front line paused. Each day brought a new horror and a new revelation. He photographed GIs sharing rations with children in shattered streets, farmers emerging from cellars where they had hidden for 4 years, French women shaving the heads of collaborators. He wasn't chasing beauty, he was chasing honesty. His camera had become a witness to rebirth and revenge, to the strange duality of liberation, joy and judgment, side by side. The military commanders had learned to tolerate him. Generals once scornful of photographers now saw how his images swayed public opinion back home. When Life magazine published his D-Day photos, subscriptions surged, and morale rose with them. The power of an image had become as strategic as any weapon. Capa had shown that one camera, in the right hands, could move a nation. He captured courage, not just carnage, an American colonel said, but Capa himself rejected the praise. I only caught what they could not look away from, he told him quietly. He worked beside men who were half his age and twice his innocence. Many didn't make it a week. He developed a superstition, never photograph a soldier twice. The first time he did, the boy was killed the next day. I think I bring bad luck, he wrote in his notebook. Yet he kept going, driven by something he couldn't name. Each time he clicked the shutter, he felt he was trying to redeem those lost frames from Omaha, the ones melted away in London's heat. Maybe by capturing more life, he could make up for the images that died before they were seen. Then came the breakout from Normandy, and with it, the great push toward Paris. The Allies were no longer crawling, they were surging. The Germans were retreating, and victory seemed close enough to taste. For Capa, it was the moment he had waited for. The reversal, the turning of the tide. The armies that had once been pinned down on the sand now swept forward like a storm. He captured convoys rolling through bombed-out villages, tanks crushing Nazi banners, and Parisians rising from the underground to tear down swastikas. In the distance, the Eiffel Tower loomed, damaged but unbroken. On August 25, 1944, Paris was liberated. Capa rode in with Free French forces, camera in one hand, cigar in the other. He climbed onto a tank to photograph the crowd's eruption. Flags waving, tears streaming, kisses exchanged between strangers. It was the opposite of Omaha. Life bursting through death's shadow. One of his most famous shots that day showed a young woman holding her baby, her head newly shaved for collaborating with the Germans. The baby stared at the crowd while the mother's eyes were lowered in shame. The picture caused outrage and fascination in equal measure. It was Capa's genius. He didn't judge, he revealed. In those months, Capa became the visual historian of liberation. His photographs weren't just news. They were symbols. Every roll of film carried evidence that the nightmare was ending. Yet even amid celebration, he never forgot what he'd seen on that first day at Omaha. "It's not victory that interests me," he wrote in a letter to his mother. "It's survival." He was aware that each smile in his photographs hid a loss, that every triumphant soldier had left someone buried behind him. The closer the Allies came to Germany, the darker the landscapes became. Towns flattened, fields burned, prisoners wandering with hollow eyes. He crossed into Germany in early 1945. The weather was bitter, the air thick with the smell of defeat. He photographed captured German soldiers, some barely teenagers, and civilians starving in their ruined cities. He saw concentration camps being opened, though he never spoke much about what he witnessed there. His pictures told enough. Skeletal figures staring blankly through barbed wire, American medics handing food to the barely living. The world had turned from invasion to revelation. Liberation had uncovered a darkness no one had imagined. Capa's reputation soared. The man who had once been dismissed as reckless was now the model of what a war correspondent should be. His name appeared beside front-page headlines. Young photographers idolized him. "Capa," wrote one journalist, "has replaced the myth of the heroic soldier with the truth of the human soldier." He had redefined courage, not as the absence of fear, but as the act of witnessing it. Even the enemy took notice. In post-war Germany, some Wehrmacht officers studied his D-Day photos, unable to believe how close he had been to their machine guns. One remarked bitterly, "He was braver than the men we shot at." Capa laughed when he heard that quote later. "Braver? No," he said, "just slower." By war's end, Capa had become synonymous with frontline truth. But he was restless. Victory didn't quiet his spirit. It stirred it. The adrenaline of war had become his addiction. Peace to him felt too silent. When Europe celebrated the end of fighting in May 1945, he found himself unable to join the crowds. He stood apart, camera lowered, watching fireworks reflected in puddles of rain. "It's over," someone shouted beside him. But to Capa, it never was. He would carry it forever. The statistics told the story of domination. 156,000 Allied troops had landed on D-Day. More than 10,000 were killed or wounded. Within a year, Hitler was dead and Europe was free. But Capa's 11 blurred photos had outlasted both armies. They had become emblems of endurance, proof that amid fire and chaos, one man could still hold a lens steady enough to preserve humanity. The magazines called him the Eye of the War. Soldiers called him Lucky Capa. He rejected both titles. "I'm just the one who didn't get hit," he said. But deep down, he knew his luck wouldn't last forever. He once told a friend, half joking, half warning, "Someday, my luck and my camera will run out at the same time." That line became legend among correspondents. They laughed when he said it, but the truth was that everyone who had been in the war carried the same shadow. Capa just happened to turn his into art. His domination wasn't of the battlefield, it was of perspective. He had changed forever how the world would see conflict. Not as strategy and flags, but as faces and fear. As 1945 turned to 1946, he walked the streets of post-war Europe, a man alive in a landscape of ghosts. His photographs from those final months of war showed no explosions, no guns, just aftermath. Children playing among rubble, lovers kissing beside ruins, an old man standing alone in a field of crosses. It was his way of saying that the storm had passed, but the scars remained. The man who had captured hell had also captured its quiet aftermath, the fragile moment when life begins again. His images now hung in galleries, appeared in newspapers, and were studied in military academies. Generals admired his courage, Civilians admired his honesty. But Capa didn't see himself as either. He simply carried his camera and kept walking, chasing one last story in a world struggling to rebuild. And as he walked, one thought followed him, heavy as the camera around his neck. He had shown the world the turning of the tide, but tides, like wars, always return. When the war ended, Robert Capa was 31 years old, but he carried the face of a man twice that age. He had lived through 5 campaigns for invasions and more close calls than he could count. The war had made his name, but it had also hollowed something out of him. He returned to Paris, the city he loved most, and for a time he tried to live like the others, to laugh in cafes, to drink in smoky rooms, to dance when jazz bands filled the night. But even in peace, he kept his cameras close, as if afraid to look at the world without them. Every time he saw a flashbulb or heard the pop of a champagne cork, his shoulders flinched. For him, the echo of Normandy never faded. People called him a hero, but he hated the word. "I am a gambler," he'd say. "I go where the dice fall." And yet, that gambler's instinct, the hunger for proximity, the need to stand one breath away from history, was what had made his name immortal. Life magazine had crowned him the greatest war photographer in the world. But greatness, Capa knew, was a poor substitute for peace. He spent his post-war years chasing distractions. Parties, friendships, love affairs. Among them was Ingrid Bergman, the luminous actress who fell for the restless photographer. They met in Hollywood, where Capa tried to reinvent himself, hoping the warmth of the California sun could bleach out the shadows of Europe. For a time, it worked. He walked red carpets, drank with directors, smiled for reporters. But the quiet moments betrayed him. He'd sit alone by the ocean, staring at the horizon, and confess to friends that he felt useless. "There's no story left for me here," he said. "No one wants to see peace." He couldn't stay in a world that pretended the past was over. He returned to Europe, camera in hand once more. His friends urged him to slow down. Henri Cartier-Bresson and David Seymour, fellow photographers, convinced him to co-found Magnum Photos, a cooperative agency where photographers would own their negatives and tell their stories without censorship. It was Capa's way of fighting a different kind of battle, for truth, for control, for dignity in storytelling. "We must show life as it is," he told his colleagues, "not as they wish it to be." Under his leadership, Magnum became a sanctuary for those who believed the camera could change conscience. But even as the world rebuilt, war called again. In 1948, Capa went to Palestine to document the founding of Israel. He stood amid gunfire once more, capturing faces of both hope and grief. It was there that his philosophy deepened. He wrote in his notes, "War is not always evil, but it is always the end of something human." That idea haunted him. He began to see his own work not as the pursuit of fame, but as a record of humanity's self-inflicted wounds. The irony that had started on Omaha Beach continued to follow him. He had gone from being mocked for carrying a camera to being praised for redefining courage itself. The soldiers who once joked about his toy now had his photos hanging in their homes. But Capa himself could never quite escape the feeling that his camera had cursed him, that it had shown him too much of life's fragility. In 1954, when the French magazine Paris Match offered him an assignment in Indochina, Capa hesitated. He was tired, older, slower, and weary of the endless repetition of history. "I'm not a boy anymore," he told his friends. But the paycheck was good, and the adventure irresistible. He boarded a plane to Vietnam, telling himself it would be his last war. The younger photographers looked at him with awe. He was a legend walking among them, the man who had survived Normandy, who had made the impossible visible. In Vietnam, the jungle was thick and humid, a far cry from the cold surf of Omaha. But the feeling was the same, the tension, the sudden bursts of violence, the helplessness. On May 25, 1954, near Tai Binh, Capa followed a French convoy moving through rice paddies. The soldiers warned him to stay behind. The area was thick with landmines. He laughed, waved them off, and walked ahead, camera ready. A moment later, there was a sharp crack. The explosion lifted him off the ground. When the soldiers reached him, his camera lay shattered beside him, the lens cracked like glass ice. Capa was still conscious for a few seconds. He tried to lift his head but couldn't. His last words were soft. "I think I stepped on a mine." He died minutes later. News spread quickly. The man who had survived 5 wars and 1,000 bullets was gone. Not by enemy fire, but by a hidden mine in a distant rice field. His colleagues at Magnum received the news in silence. Henri Cartier-Bresson simply said, "He died as he lived, with his boots on and his camera open." The irony was complete. The man who had captured hell had finally been claimed by it. His body was flown to Japan, then to the United States, where he was buried with military honors. Life magazine published a tribute issue, reprinting his Omaha Beach photographs. The editors wrote, "He showed us the courage of others by living it himself." For millions of readers, those 11 blurred frames from 1944 now carried an even deeper meaning. They were no longer just documents of war. They were fragments of a life lived too close to danger in pursuit of truth. Years later, when historians revisited D-Day, they often began with Capa's images. The blurred soldier crawling through surf, the chaos of men under fire, the water exploding around them. All had become the universal memory of the invasion. His imperfection became the standard of authenticity. Film critics, journalists, and soldiers alike agreed. If clarity is truth, then Capa's blur was honesty. Time softened his myth, but not his impact. In every war that followed, from Korea to Iraq, photographers invoked his name. They quoted his rule: "If your pictures aren't good enough, you're not close enough." It became a mantra, a challenge, and a warning. Some took it literally and died for it. Others understood the deeper meaning, that closeness was not about distance but about empathy. Capa's greatest gift was not bravery, but humanity. He didn't photograph war from above. He crawled through it shoulder to shoulder with the terrified and the doomed. His work reshaped how Americans saw their own soldiers. No longer faceless figures in uniform, they were sons, brothers, neighbors, men who could laugh one moment and vanish the next. For a U.S. audience that had endured years of rationing and fear, his images humanized the sacrifice. He didn't show victory, he showed vulnerability. And that honesty helped a generation understand both pride and loss. Decades later, curators at the International Center of Photography, founded by his brother Cornell, would recover more of his lost negatives, including the famous Mexican suitcase discovered in 2007. Inside were thousands of his pre-war photos from Spain, preserved like time capsules. When displayed, visitors wept. It was as if Capa had sent one last message from the past. Remember what it cost to forget. Today, his name stands beside truth itself. His photos hang in the Library of Congress, in museums, in classrooms. But for all the reverence, the irony remains. The clearest vision of war ever given to the world came from pictures blurred by fear. The insult that began on Omaha Beach, "You're coming with that toy?" returns here reversed by history. That toy captured eternity. The camera that soldiers mocked outlived every weapon fired that day. Its film, melted and damaged, became the moral record of a century. Robert Capa's story is not one of perfection but of persistence. It's the story of a man who looked straight into the mouth of hell and didn't blink. Not because he wasn't afraid, but because he was. His courage wasn't in what he fought against, but in what he chose to face. And when his luck finally ran out in a rice field in Vietnam, he had already done what he came to do: make the world look. The moral lingers long after the story ends. War, in Capa's lens, was not about glory. It was about endurance, about the fragments of decency that survive amid destruction. He showed us that the truest photograph is never sharp, because truth itself trembles. One of his final quotes reads, "It's not always easy to stand close to life, but it's the only way to see it clearly." That line echoes like a whisper through history, through every photojournalist who dares to go closer, through every viewer who stares at those 11 blurred frames and feels the sting of salt and fear. And as the credits roll, the narrator's final question fades into the black screen. In an age where every war lives on our screens, who will dare to step close enough again to capture the next truth and live to tell it?